Hello, and welcome once again to Friday Focus, where we do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen. That's taken from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 18. Today, Friday Focus is continuing its study on the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to be talking about radical generosity. Now, as I prepared for today's Friday Focus, the words of this little story I once heard came to mind. They were siblings. He was 8, his sister was 6. His sister had a serious illness, and to preserve her life, she needed a blood transfusion. Since he had been ill at one time with the same disease, his blood contained the necessary antibodies to help his little sister. Both their blood types were a match, so his parents, along with the doctor, explained that his blood would help his little sister to recover. Then they asked if he would give his little sister some of his blood. The little boy thought about it for a while and then said he was willing if it would save his sister's life. Soon he found himself with a needle in his arm, and he watched as the bag filled with blood that would cure his sister. After a bit, the doctor came over to see the little boy and to check on his progress. And after a few moments, the little fella blurted out a question that had been on his mind. "Doctor," he asked through quivering lips, "how soon will I die?" In the little boy's mind, this was the ultimate act of giving. Realizing that the little boy thought that giving his blood meant he would die, the doctor assured him that he and his sister would be just fine. Now, that might be a story, but it's also an illustration of radical generosity. Are you a giver? Do you practice radical generosity? Look at what Jesus had to say about giving in his Sermon on the Mount. He says this, "Watch out. Don't do your good deeds publicly to be admired by others, for you will lose the reward from your Father in heaven. When you give to someone in need, don't do as the hypocrites do, blowing trumpets in the synagogues and streets to call attention to their act of charity. I tell you the truth, they have received all the reward they will ever get." Wow, how final is that, eh? They have received all the reward they will ever get. But when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Keep it secret. Give your gifts in private, and your Father who sees everything will reward you. Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. I find 4 important things in this passage that are important to know about giving. And the first one I find is motive. Now, Merriam-Webster defines motive as something such as a need or desire that causes a person to act. According to Jesus in Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, that something is our motive. It's a critical piece of giving. Some give because they want others to see how good they are. Others give because they want the community to see that they're community-minded and therefore the community will support their businesses. Much of worldly giving is based on the hope that individuals or companies will get something back. Jesus begins this section of his sermon with words that were quite radical considering how the Pharisees usually acted. They made a huge display of their acts of giving, and Jesus said 2 things about this kind of giving. He said, first of all, they would lose the reward from their Father in heaven. And number 2, public acclaim was all the reward they would ever get. That doesn't amount to much when you finally stand before God. The second thing that I note is that giving is expected of believers. Notice verse 2 of chapter 6. Jesus says, but when you give. He does not say, if you give. Christians ought to be known for their generosity without any ulterior motive. Why? Because you are giving to Jesus through whatever cause or need to which you give. Do you remember what Jesus asked the Apostle Paul when he appeared to him on the road of Damascus? Allow me to refresh your memory. In Paul's, also Saul's, own words, he says, I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? That's from Acts 9, verse 4, Acts 22, verse 7, Acts 26, verse 14. Now, Saul was going there to hurt Christians, yet Jesus asked, why are you persecuting me? So, we see that even though Saul was persecuting believers, Jesus said Saul was persecuting him through those who were Christians. It's the same with your giving. Whether you give to an individual, a church, or a parachurch organization, you are ultimately giving to Jesus. The third thing that I notice is that when it comes to your radical giving it's between you and Jesus alone. Instead of making a big show of the gift or announcing it through the media, Jesus says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. In other words, keep quiet about it. No announcements, no trumpets, no big shows, just a pure and undefiled gift to the Lord through whatever the need happens to be. Jesus is making use of hyperbole, since it's obvious that the mind controls both the right hand and the left hand. It's impossible for the mind not to know what the right or left hand is doing at any given time. He's using exaggeration to illustrate how necessary it is to give from a pure motive, a pure heart. When it comes to Christian giving, it's all about modesty and not about flamboyance. And then the fourth thing that I note about radical generosity is this: the world's reward versus God's reward. According to this passage, you can make your giving a spectacle or give secretly, without pomp. If your giving is ostentatious so that you receive the praise of men, that's it for you. If it's given quietly without fanfare, well, here's what Jesus says. Give your gifts in private, and your Father who sees everything will reward you. Now, I like what the King James says. The King James Bible adds the word openly to the end of that statement. Your Father who sees everything will reward you openly. That doesn't surprise me a bit. Look at what Jesus says in Luke. Give and you will receive. Your gift will return to you in full, pressed down, shaken together to make room for more, running over and poured into your lap. The amount you give will determine the amount you get back. That kind of blessing is so like our Father. The choice is now yours to make. This is Dr. Vic Hollyfriend in His grace. If you have any comments or questions, you can send them to me at vicsfridayfocus@gmail.com. That's vicsfridayfocus@gmail.com. God bless you, and go make it a tremendous week.